Jeremy Goldkorn is one of China's most experienced media experts and commentators. He founded Danwei, a Guardian-affiliated blog about media, advertising and urban life in China, and is now editor-in-chief of SupChina, a New York-based independent media company focused on China. He also hosts the weekly Sinica podcast, which explores current affairs in China with journalists, writers, academics, policymakers and business people with neither fear nor favour. Jeremy, thanks very much for coming in.
My pleasure.
Now, tell us about, you live in Tennessee, so you don't live in New Zealand, but you have an idea of New Zealand's sort of dependence on China for its trading relationship. What do you make of the way that we do depend so much on China for that?
Well, China is obviously an enormous market and is going to be in the future, if things go well for New Zealand, a source of economic growth, and that's good. I am a little concerned that New Zealand is a little too dependent on China, just because New Zealand is a democracy, and in a democracy you can have people say all kinds of things, and it's very easy to offend Beijing. And as you know, your neighbours in Australia have seen recently with the effective boycott of Australian wine, if you offend Beijing, the consequences can be pretty harsh for the economy. So I don't think there should be a paranoia or fear of China that one sometimes sees in the Anglophone media all over the world, including in New Zealand. But I do think that New Zealand should be aware that there should be alternative markets for its goods and services.
Jacinda Ardern, our Prime Minister, recently addressed NATO, and she sort of went as close as she ever has to sort of criticising China, set against a backdrop of NATO also criticising China for its aspirations, I suppose, and what it considers to be its power grab in the Pacific. What do you think about those comments? Do you think she straddled that middle line that she has to?
I think she's been quite effective. I think generally speaking, New Zealand has adopted a fairly sensible approach to China. I don't think that foreign policy should be without values, and so I do think that sometimes things need to be said that are not necessarily music to Beijing's ears. My reading is that she was quite effective in balancing the different interests that New Zealand has.
At the moment, New Zealand is finding a lot of success with its kiwi fruit, its milk and dairy products and so forth. Do you think there will always be a market there in China for that, or are they building their own industries? Are they trying to become more self-sufficient in those areas?
New Zealand's products are world class. There are, as you know, an occasional visitor to this country, I can personally testify they are, of really high quality. Chinese people love good food. There will always be a market for them. However, the government can interfere with that, and as I just mentioned, Australian winemakers felt the pain of Scott Morrison's government's statements about China, and that is something that New Zealand has to be very, very aware of. That the politics could go in a slightly different direction, and there could be tariffs or non-tariff barriers erected overnight if Beijing becomes displeased with something that Wellington has done. And tariffs are one way that Beijing has done it, but in the past, for example, when Norway when the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to the Chinese dissident Liu Xiaobo in 2010, Norwegian salmon exporters found that they couldn't export their salmon to China, and it wasn't tariff-based. The sales just stopped, or there were complaints about the quality of the salmon that suddenly appeared at the borders, at customs. So these are real dangers.
Yes. What do you think China's game in the Pacific is? I mean, it's something that has come to our attention recently over the Solomon Islands.
I think their number one priority is to edge the United States out of their immediate neighborhood. And the Solomon Islands and all of their diplomatic efforts in the Pacific are a part of that. I don't think they're bent on colonial domination, but they would definitely like to see the United States retreat.
And should a country like New Zealand be concerned about that?
Yes, New Zealand should be concerned about that. It's quite difficult to find the right balance, because I don't think New Zealand should be paranoid about it. On the one hand, China is a big, economically significant country, and it is quite natural that it will seek to exert influence in its neighborhood. And that's just a fact of life that New Zealand has to deal with. But it should be concerned about the possibility of abuse of fishing rights, of abuse of mineral exploitation in the Pacific, of other possible side effects of Chinese economic activity. I don't think New Zealand should be worried about a military invasion.
Right. I mean, though, if New Zealand believe that China is overfishing parts of the Pacific, say, near us, what can we do about it?
Well, I think there should already be quiet diplomacy going on. China does care very much about its international reputation, so sometimes some slightly noisier diplomacy. But I think issues such as overfishing should be part of New Zealand's discussions with China at all levels, starting now before the issues actually happen.
Right. Moving to the US relationship with China, obviously we've seen Biden speak, US President Joe Biden speak recently in the last few days about the possibility of dropping tariffs from Chinese goods, which were implemented by Trump. Can you just explain if this is significant or not?
I think I think it is significant. I think there is an attempt to make the relationship more cordial than it was under Trump. I don't think there is a change of heart in Washington, D.C., and the consensus that has sort of come about over the last few years, and it was beginning even before the Trump administration, but obviously got a lot stronger during the Trump administration. I don't think that's really changed. The blob in Washington and the American political elite feel threatened and worried by China, and they're not going to suddenly reverse course. But it does seem that some of the tariffs might come down. I think some of that is driven by domestic economic and political concerns, the desire to ease, the burden of inflation on American voters, and some of it is perhaps coming about because of just economic rationality and the understanding that the tariffs were a pretty awful idea in the first place. But there's no sea change.
Right. It's interesting because from outside of America, if we looked at Trump, for example, he would do these actions like putting tariffs on, but on the other hand, sort of praise Xi Jinping and call him a friend and so forth. So it was kind of a very disconnected approach he took to China. What do you think happened to the US-China relationship over the Trump presidency?
Well, it certainly marked a complete shift from a long-standing policy of what is generally called engagement to something that we don't really have a name for yet. And people are dancing around, Cold War is sometimes used, economic Cold War, hostility. So there's certainly, there's been a change. And some of it is driven by American domestic political concerns. Some of it is driven, I think, by a deep sense of unease that America's best days are past. And in some ways, that's the saddest of all the motivations. But I think that's very real. And some of it is indeed driven by the Chinese government and, both their economic and their political policies. There are genuine concerns about values, and there should be genuine concerns about values when thinking about China. This is a country that does not share Western democratic values and is increasingly seeking to impose some of its own authoritarian ways of thinking on the rest of the world. So I certainly don't think that should be underestimated or discounted. But unfortunately in the US, that's in some ways only a small part of what's driving much of the behavior towards China.
Do you think China will eventually move into Taiwan? And if it does, what will the Americans do about that?
This is sort of an unpopular view, but I think it's inevitable. The Communist Party have been saying that they're going to take back Taiwan since 1949. And it's difficult for me to see that the United States has the will to really do much about it, despite the loud protestations of people in Washington, D.C.
Yes. Jeremy, just finally, where is China heading ultimately?
Well,
a big question. Just the top line.
I think its economic growth is going to continue, but I don't think we're going to see the same rapid, breakneck pace of growth as we've seen in the past. I think its dominance of electric vehicles and the supply chain of batteries and potentially all other types of new energy products and services is pretty much guaranteed. I think that it's going to be a formidable peer competitor to the United States. I think it's going to challenge the entire Western worldview. But that could all go wrong. It's in some ways it can be a lot more fragile than it looks from the outside world. I think just a recent example of a sense of fragility was the extreme lockdowns in Shanghai, which have completely changed the minds of many friends of mine in Shanghai who were living these beautiful lives, in what they saw was the most developed city in the world in some ways, with ice cream on demand that you could get by an app at 2 a.m. A 5-minute delivery of like freshly made ice cream and this kind of thing, and then suddenly being forced to be locked down for more than 2 months, sometimes actually going hungry because the supply chains just weren't there to deliver food. And that was to me a vivid example of the fact that despite its extraordinary growth and apparent strength, there are many, many fragilities in the Chinese system, and history is very far from over.
Jeremy, thank you very much for sharing your knowledge with NBR.
My pleasure, Dita. Thank you for having me.